In my previous videos, I have discussed a very curious rock band out of Glasgow, Scotland, by the name of Famous Groupies. I had stumbled onto one of their songs some time ago while traversing my way around the internet in search of music that sounded a great deal like the Beatles and Paul McCartney. In my research, I came across plenty of well-known and unknown artists who sounded a great deal like the Beatles. My point was to prove that there are a rare few who might easily slip into the shoes of a dead Beatle, and masquerade as one of them for many years, and seemingly fooling almost everyone. There are many clues that suggest that Paul McCartney died in a terrible car accident in 1966, and most of those clues have been given to us by none other than the Beatles themselves. As if they wanted the world to know their terrible secret. But if Paul McCartney did indeed die in 1966, why was it not made public? That answer is simple. In 1966, at the height of Beatlemania, millions of teenagers worldwide would have been hit with a savage blow in a way that had never been seen before, if they had been told the truth. It is believed that suicides would have happened on a scale that is incomprehensible. Much like the day President John F. Kennedy was shot, Americans were affected to the core of their being. Depression washed over the states for years. Now, imagine if one of the Beatles had died in 1966 and how that would affect the millions of adoring fans around the world. It would be a devastating blow that would be felt for years. In November of 1966, Paul McCartney died. Soon after, he was replaced. I invite you to explore the many YouTube videos that discuss this theory in depth, but for this video, I would like to tell you about a ghostwriter. The man who would write and co-write much of the McCartney catalogue, including many Beatle works. His real name is Patrick Paisley Mackenzie. He currently resides in Glasgow, Scotland. Although, there is some mystery as to whether Mr. Mackenzie is still alive or if he has recently passed. Mr. Mackenzie was a budding songwriter and session player during the 1960s and up until he retired from the music business in the mid-1980s. Enormously gifted, he could play many instruments and was often seen around town with a guitar in hand. He played in many local groups and eventually made his way to Northern England and then London, where he would contribute his writing skills to various unknown artists. It was during this time that he met and befriended Denny Laine, but I will come back to that a bit later. Roger Joseph McGough was one of the leading members of the Liverpool Poets, a group of young poets influenced by beat poetry and the popular music and culture of the 1960s. He and his friend John Gorman organised arts events. Later they met Mike McGeera, or Michael McCartney, Paul's brother. Together they formed the trio The Scaffold. They worked the Edinburgh Festival Fringe until they were signed to Parlophone Records in 1966. The Scaffold performed a mixture of comic songs, comedy sketches and the poetry of McGough. The group scored several hit records, reaching number 1 in the UK singles chart in 1968 with their version of Lily the Pink. McGough wrote the lyrics for many of the group's songs and also recorded the musical comedy poetry album McGough and McGeera. In 1971 Grimm's was formed, originally as a merger of The Scaffold, the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band featuring Vivian Stanshall, and the Liverpool Scene. Vivian Stanshall, who is believed to be the replacement for Paul McCartney after his death, made quite an impression on Roger. It was during his time with the Doodah Band that Roger and Vivian became good friends. It should be noted that Roger McGough was responsible for much of the humorous dialogue in the Beatles' animated film Yellow Submarine, although he did not receive an on-screen credit. On the 2nd of March 1978, McGough appeared in All You Need Is Cash, a mockumentary detailing the career of a Beatles-like group called the Rattles. This brings the story back to Scottish songwriter Patrick Mackenzie, for you see, Patrick Paisley Mackenzie and Roger McGough are in fact the very same person. It is assumed that Patrick created an alias or stage name for himself, much like Mike McCartney did, and that name would become his permanent name as the ghostwriter for Paul McCartney. for all his unaccredited work with the Beatles. You would think there would be many photos of Roger with any given Beatle. There isn't. And for all the many coincidental connections to Paul McCartney, you would think there would be many photos of them together as well. There isn't. Let's connect the dots. Patrick Mackenzie, a young Scottish up-and-comer, yet not terribly known for his work at the time, moves to northern England, mingles and works with the local musicians, befriends McCartney's brother Mike McGeer, as well as Denny Lane, who then acts as liaison to him, joining the Bonzo Dog Doodah band, who happens to have Vivian Stanshall as a member. Small world. At this point, it is fairly easy to put the pieces of this puzzle together. At some point after Paul McCartney's death, Vivian Stanshall assumed the role as Paul McCartney, and with brother Mike McCartney's blessing and full knowing, did allow Roger McGough aka Patrick Mackenzie to ghostwrite and collaborate with Vivian Stanshall on what would become the balance of McCartney's Beatle works as well as his solo work with Wings. Let us also note that it was in Scotland where Roger McGough met Michael McCartney. This was no coincidence. When I first heard the music of the famous groupies, it as if I was hearing unreleased early solo McCartney songs as played by someone else. I was driven to investigate, and so I sent several emails to a young man by the name of Kirkcaldy Mackenzie. He did confess in our second email exchange that his grandfather wrote most of the music, and most of it had been written in the early 1970s. I found this all very strange and unusual, which inspired me to investigate further. I asked young Mr. Mackenzie if I might sample more of their music, but instead, I was sent lyrics. Those lyrics did have a McCartney style and design to them, but I needed more information and more music to be sure if I was onto something here. While I researched writers and musicians in the Scotland scene of the mid-60s, I was sent an email by an unknown source. As cloak and dagger as this all sounds, I was certain that someone who had watched my videos had decided to have some fun with me at my expense. But, after following that lead, I was pleasantly surprised to find that it actually leads to something rather important. So, this new information coupled with the timing of the famous groupies album release was finally able to listen to this collection of vintage written songs and decide for myself if this writer was a fluke. I was incredibly impressed with the previous few songs that I had heard on the band's SoundCloud site, and now I could place every other song under the microscope and see what might be learned. First, I must admit that I am a Beatle fan and I quite enjoy Fall's work since Paul left us. And after hearing these 18 remarkable songs, I simply cannot believe that anyone other than Fall's ghostwriter could have written them. There are too many songs to dissect and compare to that of McCartney's early works, so I will simply say that I am a firm believer that these songs were written by the same person who wrote any or all of the Wings album material prior to 1978. I've since sent Mr. Mackenzie an email with my congratulations, and I did ask many questions. His reply was straightforward and polite, but many of my questions were ignored. My hope is to interview the Mackenzie family, if allowed. If these songs were written by an undiscovered gent who lived a quiet life in Scotland and then passed over his life's work to his grandson to record, well then, that too is quite a remarkable story. Reality is sometimes impossible to comprehend, even when the answers are everywhere.